Okay, here we go with chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3, A Girl Soaked in Blood. Mo led Percy and me across the road from the Carlson place south towards town. It was the least likely direction that the killer would have gone, and I knew my dad had sent us that way on purpose because of me, or maybe because of the beer on Mo's breath. Petunia and Lulabelle jogged happily behind us through the dead fall grass and underbrush, but I kept looking back at the house. I'd been working at the jail since I was a kid, sweeping floors and washing windows mostly, but I'd been a sheriff's son most of my life. I could have helped if they'd have let me. But as the lights from the cruisers and the Carlson house disappeared and the sound of the other men and dogs faded, I started to pay attention. I realized that we were looking for a killer, actually hoping to find him, and not just any killer, but the most famous killer in the country who carved up his victims and left no blood behind. Except there'd been plenty of blood on the girl standing in the Carlsons' living room. Maybe that was the secret, and we would find the killer crouched by the creek and covered in it too. "You're making too much noise," Percy said to me. I slowed. Percy and Mo were hunters with practiced hunters' walks. Even the Labradors knew how to tread softly. "I should have stayed back," I said. "I'm glad you didn't. I feel about ready to jump out of my skin." "Percy," Mo hissed. "Quiet." But I could hear it in his voice, and I could see it in the way the shotgun shook in his grip. Mo didn't want to go either. There was a lot of nothing south of the Carlson house, just a creek where it crossed back and a lot of trees between there and town for someone to hide in. And we'd been braver together in the driveway when we were angry about our neighbors lying dead in their house. Now we went slow, and then slower, listening for the barks and shouts that meant someone else had found him first. We got to the tree line close enough to hear the water gurgling in the creek, and then the dogs refused to go on. Percy tugged on Petunia's makeshift leash. I patted Lulabelle. "Come on, girl." But she only whined and dug her paws into the ground. Petunia, Lulu, get on," Mo ordered. "It's just water. You're duck dogs, you two stupid." He reached for their scruffs and tried to pull them along. The Labradors whined and barked. Eventually one of them snapped at his hand. "What's gotten into them?" Percy asked. I grabbed Lulabelle's collar again and buried my fingers in her fur. "Maybe we should listen." Mo cussed and stood taller in the dark. A beam of his flashlight cast back and forth, and I held my breath looking into it, afraid at any moment it would show a face in the trees. "I guess I'll go myself," said Mo. "You boys stay with the dogs." He hadn't taken more than a couple of steps before something got up and moved, something big that snapped twigs and crashed through the underbrush. The dogs went crazy barking. Neither Percy nor I could hang on. I think the twine broke in the middle, but Lulu might have just pulled it out of my hands. "Petunia, Lulu," Percy shouted as they ran. "God damn it," Mo shouted. We stood frozen. The dogs weren't running towards the sound. They were running away from it. Mo pushed us behind him and pointed his gun at the creek. "Backtrack to the Carlsons," he said. "Find the girls and get them into the truck. I'm right behind you." We found the Labradors back at the road, circling nervously and whining. We caught them and loaded them up, and Mo joined us not long after, breathing hard from running. Then we stood by the truck and let our hearts slow. In the safety of the light cast from the house and the red and blue flashing from the cruisers, it was easy to recover our nerve. "Percy," said Mo, "drive Michael home and then take the dogs back and stay with Janie." "What about you?" Percy asked. "I'll go to the house and join up with another search party. You boys shouldn't be out here anyway." "At least take one of the dogs." "So I can chase her around again? There's no use without proper leashes." "But Pop..." "Just go home and I'll see you in the morning." Percy and I drove to our house in town with the black labs between us on the bench seat. When we pulled into my driveway, I said, "You okay? You want to stay over?" He thought about it, petting the dogs. "I'd better go home. I don't think Mo wants Shani to be by herself." Okay. I looked at my house. All the downstairs lights were on and it looked safe. I knew my mom would probably be heading into the jail a few blocks away, and I would need to stay home and look after my little sister Dawn, even though she would already be sleeping. Before I got out of the truck, I gave Lulabelle a good scratching. Even then, when none of us wanted to admit it, I couldn't help thinking that those dogs turning tail had saved us from something. I went inside and found my mom with her coat already on, ready to go to the jail like I figured. Are you going to stay the night? I asked. I imagined so, she said. They're going to book the girl in to stay. Book her? Why? I don't know, Michael. Look after your sister. And then she left. She went to the jail to help the doctor clean Marie up. They wiped her down from head to foot, examined her, and found no injuries. Then my mom put her into a bath, and later she told me that even after all the wiping, the water in the bath turned as red as beet soup. My mom didn't stay the night. The woman's cell sat alone, connected to the rest of the jail on the western end of the second floor above the sheriff's office. It was built into the kitchen of our former family home from back in the days when the sheriff used to live on the premises, and is separated from the men's cells by a few layers of brick and plaster and a good 40 feet. We didn't live there anymore. My father, the sheriff, Richard Jensen, built us a new house in town. Not so far from the jail that he couldn't still walk to work on a nice day, but far enough to keep my little sister from hearing any questionable language from rowdy prisoners sobering up in the cells downstairs. On the rare occasion when the woman's cell had an occupant, Mrs. Wilson, after being caught a few too many times for intoxicated driving, for example, my mother would stay there. She didn't like to leave them alone in that drafty place surrounded by bars and walls, even though most of the female prisoners stayed only one night. Marie Catherine Hale would remain there for 144 alone for all but 3. After my mom left, I went up to my room. I tried to finish up my homework. I read a little. Mostly, I lay on my back and thought about the Carlsons and the bloodless murders. At the time of Marie's arrest, we thought that the murders had begun in early August, that Peter Knupp of Loop City, Nebraska, had been there first. From there, the killings seemed to escalate. A pair of student nurses with their throats cut on August 6th, a trucker and a hitchhiker on the 13th, an elderly couple in Iowa on the 16th. And so it went on, with new victims found every few days until the students in Madison, when everything stopped. A week went by, then another. Lights still burned late into the night, and doors that had never before been locked found themselves with new deadbolts. But that would just be the way of things now. 12 people were dead. 12 people bled out in their own homes or in their cars, or like that poor gas station worker Jeff Booker, murdered in the service office. The papers increased their circulation by transfixing us with details. So little blood had been found at the crime scenes, and no one knew how or why. The wounds were very clean, very neat. No one was stabbed. They were cut at the throat or at the wrist, sometimes deep in the leg. Could it have been the work of an ordinary kitchen knife, the papers asked? Maybe, but so far, none had turned up missing at any of the victims' homes. I don't know how much time passed with me lying there thinking, but I was still awake when my parents came home a while later and I heard them talking softly downstairs. The baby, my mother said. What's going to happen to the baby? I thought of that little baby, a 2-year-old girl named Patricia. She had been inside the house in the very same room when it happened. The neighbor said Sarah had a sister, my father said. I imagine she'll go with her. My mother is a tall, tough woman, and equal to my dad in both heart and height, or so he liked to tease. But when he said that, she started to cry. I imagined them there in the kitchen, his arms around her back, turning her gently back and forth, his chin resting on the top of her head. She had cried before when terrible things had happened. When the Ernest family's station wagon had rolled during the blizzard of 54 and killed everyone inside, including their 5-year-old boy Todd, she'd cried for days. But that night her crying sounded different. What happened to the Ernest family was a tragedy. What happened to the Carlsons was maddening. It was terrifying. It was inexplicable. They came upstairs a few minutes later, and my dad came down the hall after he saw my light was still on. Michael, you awake? Yes, sir. He poked his head in. You all right? Dawn all right? Yes, sir. My father looked over his shoulder and stepped inside. He closed the door behind him so my mother and sister wouldn't hear. Before he spoke, he sat down on the foot of my bed like he hadn't done since I started high school. I'm sorry about their boy, about your friend Stephen. Me too, I said, and I started to cry. My dad put his hand on my back. I was surprised I had cried. Even though it was terrible, we hadn't known the Carlsons well, and my father was wrong when he said Steve and I were friends. I knew him, and we'd palled around some at school. He played football, I preferred baseball, and even during baseball season I was more interested in books. But in the months following their murders, I would come to learn more about Steve and the Carlsons than I ever imagined. The whole town would, so that by the end of the investigation, we would think of them almost as our own family and mourn them in the way we never would have had they simply died in some accident. My father gave a big sigh and got off my bed. You should get some sleep now, he said. Everything is right tonight, and tomorrow won't be easy. He put his hat back on. You're going back out? Someone's got to stay at the jail, and we need men at the Carlsons. State's coming in to give us a hand with the extra patrols and roadblocks. No one's getting to their beds tonight. Dad, I said as he turned to go, what about the girl? I hadn't stopped thinking of her face and her eyes, her body soaked with blood. Marie Hale. Her name is Marie Catherine Hale. Who is she? How did she manage to escape? He stopped with his hand on the doorknob. I don't think that she did. Chapter 4. The Loss of the Carlsons. Before the murders came to Black Deer Falls, there had been 12 known victims. Peter Kump, 26, from Loop City, Nebraska. He'd been found on August 3rd, lying on his front porch with his throat slit. The student nurses, Angela Hawk and Beverly Nordale, found sitting upright in their car in Norfolk, Nebraska on August 6th, not far from a roadhouse bar. The elderly couple were Walter and Evangeline Taylor, found on August 16th but killed on August 8th. They were discovered in bed with their wrists cut on the outskirts of Sioux City, Iowa. Some thought their deaths had been a mutual suicide caught up in the sensationalism of the moment. On August 13th, truck driver Marie Monty Latrunu, aged 40, along with an unidentified drifter, found a mile apart on Highway 30 near Grand Junction. August 18th, Jeff Booker and Stephen Hill, gas station attendants killed in the same attack, their bodies found a day apart. As Stephen Hills was located across the road in an open field, his pants around his ankles and a deep cut in his inner thigh. August 24th, Cheryl Warrens, 34, a waitress at a truck stop in Mason City where Monty's rig had been abandoned. And then the graduate students in Wisconsin on August 29th, Richard Covey, 24, and Stacy Lee Brandberg, 23. No doubt their names are familiar, but perhaps none is more familiar than Marie Catherine Hale. The way it was splashed across the headlines and her photo posted on the nightly news, it would be impossible not to know her or to have formed an opinion one way or the other. Murderess, accomplice, hostage, seductress, victim. Over the course of the investigation, she would be characterized in any one of those ways. But those were only headlines. They were only guesses. Easy labels to fit her into easy boxes. Marie Hale was a pretty girl, not quite 16, more than a full year younger than me, though she often seemed much older. She was pretty, but not the beauty the paper said she was beneath the flattering photos they printed. Most days of her incarceration she spent standing beside the window of her cell wearing borrowed clothing. Pants that were too long had to be rolled to the ankle, a white button shirt, and her brunette hair tied back with a short piece of black ribbon. She wore no makeup and never asked for any except for a tube of red lipstick her mother gave her. To cheer her up, my mother said. Though later she would remark that it looked somehow much darker on Marie than it had on her. She was quiet, and her cell was kept very clean, though I never saw her clean it. She spent most of her time looking out across the parking lot and into the long stretch of trees that separated the jail from the county highway. When she moved, it was to pace, slowly, but with a patient sort of purpose. She reminded me of the large cats I once saw stalking me through their enclosure at the Como Zoo on a family trip to the state capitol. Harmless, but only for the bars. It might seem strange that I would think so. I was a young man and an athlete, fit from a summer spent racing after balls in center field and delivering papers. But any man twice my size would have felt the same. She was unsettling. When she paced and when she sat, very still and so calm, her eyes just like they were the night I saw her slicked and covered in the Carlson's blood. I tell myself I never really feared her, but at first I would only dare to reach to the bars when she was standing by the window. Only then did she seem as small as she was. Only then did she seem as lost, like a girl awaiting a thunderstorm or a strike of lightning. I told Percy about her the morning after the murders when he picked me up for school. I told him how I'd seen her inside the Carlsons' living room. I guess I shouldn't have, but just like I shouldn't have looked. But I'd known Percy since the day he saw me in first grade and decided he would be my best friend. I could trust him. "How's your dad doing?" I asked as we sat in the school parking lot. "How's your dad doing?" Percy asked back. Then he sighed. "I wonder if anyone else's dogs turn chicken like ours did. You don't really think it's a bloodless killing, do you? I mean, that'd be too awful." "Would it be better if it wasn't?" I asked. "Would it have been kinder to Steve and his mom if it had been Bob who had done it? If he'd just snapped and taken a hatchet to everybody?" "No," Percy said. "Christ, the things you think of." But I was wondering, too, whether it was really a bloodless murder. It hadn't been exactly the same. There had never been anyone found alive at any of the other crime scenes for a start, and there'd never been any blood, or at least not as much as had covered Marie Catherine Hale. "I don't want to go in there," Percy said, staring at the school. "I feel like as long as I don't go in there, none of it actually happened." But it had happened. Search parties were still out looking for the killer. The state patrol had come in to set up roadblocks and do door-to-door house checks. There at the school, it could have been any other day. But if we looked farther out, we'd have seen cops and men and dogs combing through the fields, socking us in. I tapped Percy twice on the arm with my fist, and we got out and went inside. The Carlsons were a successful family, not well-to-do, but respected. The farm had been in the family for 2 generations, and people in town knew Mr. Carlson as a good farmer with either a real knowledge for crop rotation or the inside track on obtaining federal subsidies, depending on who you asked. Their son, my classmate Steve, was universally liked. Not the best player on the football team, but he made first string. He wasn't funny, but he was quick to laugh, which is often just as important. And the night before, someone or something went into the Carlsons' farmhouse and slit each of their throats. It was already being whispered that they were killed close enough together that had they reached out, they could have held hands. Percy and I walked through the halls, writing the news of the Carlsons' death like a strange sort of ripple. It was easy to see the difference between those who knew and those who didn't, and stranger still to watch the news hit. To see Joanne Burke's face go slack, and watch her reach out and grab for the arms of the person who told her. I saw Carol coming down the hall and knew that she knew. Her eyes were blank and red-rimmed. "Michael," she said, and then she just stood there hugging her books. A cry rang out from somewhere, and it woke her up, and she shook her head and walked away. Our class at Black Deer Falls High School is made up of 212 students. The entire school, from freshmen to seniors, amounts to 1,169. Steve's sudden and permanent absence ran through us like a crack through ice. It was something we treaded around lightly until we were sure it would hold. All day long we waited for one of our teachers to receive a slip of paper at the door and announce that it was a mistake, that Steve was fine, just out with the flu. Even I was waiting for that. By the time the day was over, I was exhausted. People figured I knew what happened since Sheriff Jensen was my dad, and I didn't mind them asking, but there were only so many times I could say that I didn't know. "You've got to go by the jail," Percy said when we met at my locker. "I just want to go home." "No, you don't. You've had your nose stuck in the papers all summer, and now that the bloodless murders are here and the witness is sitting in your dad's jail, you're going to tell me you want to go home?" I glanced at him. Practically since the moment it happened, I'd been thinking of what a story it was. What a headline dropped so suddenly into the middle of nowhere, Black Deer Falls. I wondered how Matt McBride would write it up for the Star. I wish I'd been around at the Carlson house when he showed up on the scene. I started to think about asking him if I could help him out. And every time I thought that, I hated myself for it. Look, said Percy, I know it's real now. I know it's Steve, but that makes it more important, doesn't it? For you to find out? For us? Don't you think I'll seem like a snoop? Yeah, but, he shrugged. Come on, I'll drive you. By the time Percy dropped me off in the parking lot of the sheriff's station, my curiosity had won out. I had to know if the murders of Steve and his parents had really been a bloodless killing. Part of me even hoped that they were, and it wasn't just me. The whole town was torn with grief and wanting that mark for Black Deer Falls on the map. We didn't know then what it would mean. We were caught up in the story like everyone else. I went inside, figuring I'd ask around and see if Bert or Charlie needed any help, or ask Nancy if she wanted me to run any errands. I half expected it to be empty, for my father and the deputies to be working the scene out at the farm. But when I got there, my dad was standing in the door to his office, surrounded by both of his deputies. Of the three of them, only Charlie looked fresh, but then he always did, with his thick, dark eyebrows and slicked back hair. My dad looked like he might fall asleep standing up with a cup of coffee in his hand. Michael, my dad said, and the deputies turned. Hi, Michael, said Charlie. Hi, Mikey, said Bert, before looking back at my dad and stepping out of his way. You shouldn't be here today, son. I'm sorry, sir, I said. I just thought you could use the extra help. I don't know that there's much to do. He rubbed his eyes. I should be getting home myself soon to try and get some sleep. I guess you can clean up around here a little. Give me half an hour, then we can go home together. I nodded, and my presence was soon forgotten as I busied myself emptying trash bins and pushing in chairs. My dad and the deputies moved into the relative privacy of his office, and I went on down the halls, putting things back in the storage closets that had been left out, and noting the particular quiet from the holding cells. They could have been empty. They often were on a weekday afternoon, but I had the distinct impression that they were not, and the jailed men were simply quiet, as if they too were intently listening for anything that could explain what had happened. When I reached the door to our old kitchen and the woman's cell, it was almost by accident. It was my old house after all, and I often wound up there. My feet just carried me in that direction if I wasn't paying much attention. I'd look up, and there would be the door. Brown wood painted white on the jail-facing side, as if the change of color provided another layer of separation between the two adjoining structures. I stopped and stared at the white paint. All of a sudden, I felt like I was a kid again, that my mother would be inside, standing at the stove or seated at the table. Then I snapped out of it. The girl on the other side, in the cell, must have heard me come up the steps. She must have been waiting, wondering what I was doing there, so I opened the door. They had cleaned her up. Gone was the blood, soaked and streaked from head to foot down the bathtub drain. Gone were the blood-drenched clothes, stained so dark that I could barely remember what they were. Marie Catherine Hale wasn't facing me when I came in, and her hair was dry now, and soft-looking, deep brown that lightened at the edges. She didn't turn when she heard the door, just kept looking through the window at the parking lot and a sliver of street below, and beyond that heavy, wide lines of trees that stand between the jail and the highway. It will be dark soon, she said. I was wondering if I would see you, Michael. You know my name, I said. They talk about you a lot. She turned. Her eyes were large and hazel, flecked with brown, and not the reddish brown I had imagined from seeing her so drenched in blood. Her voice was low and calm, businesslike. You shouldn't be here, she said. And then, before I could agree, or maybe you're thinking that I shouldn't be here, but you'd be wrong. She smiled a little, just with the corner of her mouth. I'm Marie Catherine Hale, I said. I know. I know you know, but that's all you know, all they know. She had her hair down that day, out of the ribbon she favored later, for court. You can just call me Marie, you know. You don't need to say the whole thing. But that's what they'll call you in the papers, if you make the papers, I said. I've already made the papers. The reporters got here this morning. You missed them, I guess, but you won't. I'm about to make your little town briefly, uncomfortably famous. Briefly, uncomfortably famous. I liked her choice of words. How old are you, I asked. I'll be 16 in December. You got a smoke? I patted my pockets even though I didn't smoke myself. Sorry. She turned away from the window in a fast spin and paced the short length of the cell before plucking down on the bed. which was better than what the men's cells provided, but still not much more than a cot. Figures. They wouldn't give me one downstairs either. Said I was too young. You seem older. She frowned slightly. Yeah, people always think I'm older than I am. She tapped her fingernails against the bars. When she looked at me again, a thrill went through my whole body. She'd been there. She'd been in that house when it happened. But it was more than that. Marie Hill was not the kind of girl I was used to talking to. She was a fast girl, with her smokes and the way she moved, the direct look in her eyes. She was the kind of girl the sheriff's son is supposed to ignore. What happened to you, I asked. What were you doing at the Carlsons? That's a long story. I love stories, I said, long, short, and in between. Her eyes sharpened, focusing in on me like they'd been through the Carlsons' window. It had been nearly impossible to piece those two images together. The girl covered in blood with this one until that moment. Is that why you're here? She asked. To get the story? No, I said. I gestured quickly to the rest of the room. The attached kitchen, the bare dining table with only one chair. I used to live here. I wasn't even sure that I would be in the cell. I wasn't even sure you would be in the cell. There's got to be someplace more comfortable you could stay until your family can come and get you. My family, she said and laughed. The words seem foolish to me now, but at the time, I didn't know what was so funny. No matter what my dad seemed to think, I couldn't imagine that she was anything other than a lucky girl who had survived a horrible attack. No one's coming to get me, she said. They're charging me downstairs. Charging you? As an accomplice. But that's crazy. Why is it crazy? She asked. Because you're just a girl, I said, and even though I knew she wasn't, she could have been from Black Deer Falls. She was no big city sophisticate or a tanned blonde from California. She talked the same way we did, walked the same way, went to our same churches. But did you? I asked, are you? She shrugged. Better not say any more. She held up her right hand as if she were taking an oath. Anything I say can be held against me in a court of law, and you'd better get out of here. Go back to where you came from before you're missed. I turned to go without another word, thinking she must be lying about her age to be able to order me around like that. Michael, she called out. When you come back, bring me some smokes.